Wonderful. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are today. I'm really delighted to be hosting this panel. I've just been so fascinated as I've been preparing for today, just at the depth and the breadth of issues that we have to tackle together. And we've got 75 minutes, so we've got quite a long time. So I really would encourage you. This is your time. This is your event. This is for you. So please, as Sherilyn says, do get involved. Do put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat as we go through. So as we move into the moderated conversation after the opening statements by both Luba and Richard and Meera, then we can get into a good conversation with all the different people who are on this call from so many different countries of the world. It'd be lovely to sort of represent that diversity of the audience in the conversation. So as Sherilyn says, we're here today to have a good debate and discussion about the real challenge of how do we best cover climate change, keep our audiences engaged, when typically news is all about the headlines and what's happening today. And so I'm really delighted to be joined by these fantastic speakers. So we're first of all going to be hearing from Luba and Richard from ACAS, and they're going to be sharing some really interesting research about what's being produced and what's wanted. And then we're going to be hearing from Meera Selva. She's the Deputy Director of the Reuters Institute and also the Director of their wonderful fellowship program. But is also here today speaking also as the co-founder of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. So she's got some really interesting findings from the first cohort of that network that she's going to share with us. So let me hand over now to Luba and to Richard to take us away. Luba, Richard, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jane and Sherilyn, for the introduction. We're very excited to be here today and to be sharing this new research with you. I shall share my my screen. Okay. So what we're going to cover today is 4 gaps that we found between what global audiences may need or want from climate change news to engage in the story and what providers actually cover. But before we start, I'll let Richard introduce himself as well.
Hi, I'm Richard Addy, co-founder of ACAS, and we've been over the last month or so been doing the research work to underpin some of the presentation.
Okay. The slide isn't moving, so sorry. I'll share again. We'll get there. Okay, I'm going to do it manually like this so it works. Okay, firstly, we're going to be talking about the volume gap. So in order to engage audiences, they need to stumble on news coverage frequently. However, what we found through the research that we did is that climate change coverage is a drop in the ocean of news. What we mean by that? Looking at analysis of GDELT news online database of 750 million stories since 2017 has revealed a really interesting picture. So last year, in the last 12 months, the coverage has been around 1% of all news coverage has contained the word climate change in it. And if we look at the both last year and last 5 years, on the average coverage is 1, and where we have higher coverage, albeit from a very small base, is in Oceania, and India has been we've had the lowest coverage, climate coverage in India, and we're going to talk later on about why that might be. So what we see is that in the last 5 years, the global news coverage peaked during COP26 last year. As you can see here from the peak line, but then fell back to, once the story was no longer fresh or contemporaneous, it fell back to baseline. One of the things that we were interested in ACAS to do is understand what's the level of interest in the story during the UN COP26 climate change conference. So in 4 countries around the world, we commissioned and conducted surveys asking audiences how interested, whether they followed the story somewhat, very, or extremely closely during just before or at the beginning of the story and at the end. And what we found is that in each of the countries, less than a third of the audiences followed the story at all. So even at its peak, it doesn't generate enormous amount of interest. But actually, what was interesting also to note is how marginal the interest in the stories in the US, and also the fact that at the end of the period, actually the interest fell down rather than maintain. So the relevance gap is the second gap.
So given the context of the volume gap, one of the interesting things for us to understand is to what extent audiences perceive climate change as relevant to them personally, and to what extent we need to make the stories have much more relevant angles that engage audiences. So one of the things we did during the climate change period, during the COP26 period, was ask audiences in Australia, UK, Canada, and USA an open-ended question. So we're not anchoring them at all. We just asked them generally, what worries you nowadays? And then we asked them also, what global issues worry you nowadays? And when we asked about global issues, climate change connects with about a quarter of all audiences. But when we asked about their own personal worries, it goes much lower down. And especially low in the US, where you can see the gap between a global worry, 23%, and as a personal worry, 3%, which leads us to recognize that to make climate change a more personal worry, there needs to be more relevance to their personal concerns. This is a similar analysis to the one Luba presented slightly earlier. And what we found fascinating is we broke down the mentions of climate change by every country in the world to see which countries or which states had the highest proportion of articles mentioning climate change. And what we found was that 7 out of the 10 countries with the highest coverage of articles mentioning climate change were actually island states. And this is from the last year, but when you look over 5 years, the trend is the same. And that points towards the power of relevance. And maybe it gives us a window into what the level should be like. So as Luba said, the world level currently is about 1%, 1.5%. Actually, in these countries, it ranges from 4 to 9%. So arguably, the coverage of climate change should be 4 to 9 times higher than it currently is. And coming back to the same chart we showed earlier around COP26 globally, this is a chart, the same chart, but just for the United Kingdom. And what you can see is, remember, the global average of mentions of climate change in articles is 1%. For the world, it peaked at about 4% during COP. For the United Kingdom, it peaked at 12%. And that's because of the proximity of the event in the country. And Luba will say a bit more about building on that notion of proximity. We said earlier on that audiences have less of a smaller proportion of audiences say that they are personally worried about climate change. There's an amazing monthly survey carried out by Ipsos Mori across the world, 27 countries, including in Asia Pac, including India, China, Australia, Malaysia, South Korea. And they ask every month, what are the issues that worry you in your country? And here we see the top 4 issues, understandably at the moment, is COVID, poverty, inequality, unemployment, and corruption, financial corruption. So those are the global concerns. Interestingly, when we look at the kind of articles that are written about over the last year, we see to some extent a bit of a mismatch between what is written about on online media. And this reflects about 1.5 million stories over the last year. We see a slight disconnect. So poverty and corruption are less written about in relation to how people are concerned about them. But zoning into climate change, we looked at the number of climate change articles that also touch on those issues that audiences are concerned about. The hypothesis here is that if you're touching on the issues that audiences are concerned about within climate change coverage, you're more likely to get engagement. And once again, we found that a number of the issues weren't alighted upon enough to increase relevance, especially around corruption and poverty. Are there opportunities to bring those angles in more, to lesser extent unemployment, bring those angles in more to draw audiences in? Because if you just rely on the climate change narrative, that's going to be more challenging. And then looking at the lens through another way, arguably, one could argue that all stories should challenge themselves to see whether there's a climate change angle. So we looked at inequality stories, poverty stories, economic stories, taxes stories, etc., and saw to what extent each of them mentioned climate change over the last year. And you can see that the percentages are quite low. Of course, we don't expect it to be high in every area, but it appears that there's more opportunity to bring a climate change angle into the everyday story that covered across the piece.
So the third gap we found is the emotions gap. And I'm acutely aware that journalists rarely talk about emotions or think about emotions as a lens through which they assess their coverage. But in relation to climate, this is incredibly important, because in order for audiences to engage with the story, they need to feel that the benefits of doing that outweigh the costs. And emotionally at the moment, it seems that the coverage, the cost, the psychological cost to them of consuming the coverage outweighs the benefits of doing so. They tend to feel despondent and disempowered, and that's a real problem, especially and even more so for young audiences, as we'll cover shortly. So one of the things we did with Richard is ask audiences about what emotions they felt. Again, these are open-ended questions, so spontaneous answers we were looking for. What emotions audiences feel when they think of climate change? And secondly, separately, we asked what emotions they felt when they thought or consumed climate change news coverage. So this slide here tells us what they feel per se about climate change. And what became a very significant finding is that sadness consistently is used as the most frequent, is quoted to be the most frequent emotion that audiences feel. Now, sadness is a really deactivating emotion. It does not propel us to do things. It makes us contract. And in fact, sadness is more likely to be felt than fear or frustration, and certainly much more so than hope and anger. When in 2 of the countries, as I mentioned, we asked the same question, but one was about news and the other was just about climate change. And when we look at sadness, proportion of audiences who feel sadness is much higher in the UK when they think about climate change coverage than climate change per se. And the same trend, although less acute, is also exists in the UK, in the US. So what this led us to believe, and we've seen that previously, is that news overlays an additional negative bias onto already a despondent feeling amongst the audience. So what we found is that the emotions that audience are more helpful for them to feel if they want to engage with coverage and even more so engage with action on climate would be hope and anger. These are activating emotions. But what we're finding in all the countries, so UK, US, Nigeria, we did this for, is that sadness, fear, and worry, which are deactivating emotions, are 3 times more likely to be felt than anger and hope by audiences who consume news on the topic. And I want to actually highlight something which I think is really important, and that is the potential disengagement and apathy of a very big group of people, audiences in different countries. One of the questions we asked recently in a survey was, when news reports, what period should news reports focus on holding those to power to account and look for improvements? Is it 2030, 2050, which is typically what politicians talk about, and governments and intergovernmental organizations, or should it be now 2022 or 2025? And what struck us as meaningful is that a big proportion of people answered it doesn't matter. Now, this could be because they're apathetic, they feel disempowered, or are disengaged from the story. Either way, in the UK, it was almost 48% who answered that, which is very significant. In Nigeria, 39%, and US, 23%. So this is something we need to worry about.
And then the final gap that we want to talk about today is the solution gap. And what we recognize is that if we are going to have the behavioral change that the climate change challenge demands, audiences and stakeholders need to be clear about what to do. However, the analytics that we've looked at and the survey evidence that we've looked at is showing that solutions-based news coverage is lost in a gigantic choir of news and an ocean of different stories. So one of the pieces of research we did was to look at the Google News article database, and we looked at headlines for all those Google News stories. And we found just over 250,000 stories had the climate change in the title. But when we tried to add in a solutions dimension, we found only 0.5% of those climate change entitled stories included solutions in the title, and less than 0.2% included the term climate change solutions, giving us a strong indication that at a headline level, there's a deficit, a very significant deficit of stories which are focusing or giving a window into solutions. And then even more profoundly, one could argue, is there's an excellent piece of work that's been pushed out by Ipsos Mori, a solutions survey, again looking at 27 countries, including India, China, Malaysia, Australia, and South Korea, and they asked people what they believe about the impacts of climate change when they're from what they hear, and a shocking 62% say that they hear much more news about negative impacts than they hear about progress. And it's a really, obviously there's a recognition that this is a significant story with very negative implications, but the question is the balance right? And when we look across all the different geographies cut by different ways, we see that concern about the universal nature of the lack of progress is cuts across all regions. And then in particular, we're seeing a sizable minority of young people feeling it's too late to fix the climate change problem. So that's the solution survey I've just talked about. About 20% of young people globally believe it's too late to fix the climate change problem. And that really links into the point Luba just made around potential apathy, potential disengagement, potential fatalism, which means that to cut through that fatalism, we may need to reframe how we think about telling the story and engaging young people. And on this section, just want to actually leave you with a very powerful quote by a consultant, communications consultant from an organization called Words for Everything. I just want to read out the first part around her analysis around young people's high levels of fatalism. Firstly, young people are dealing with the certainty that they will bear the brunt of the changing climate, with the goal to evoke some action or outrage. Some media and non-profits document the horrors that await them by instilling fear without providing any concrete solutions. There is much debate about solutions journalism, but simply instilling fear for a future that is doomed will unsurprisingly result in fatalism. And that's something that's incredibly even more pervasive for young people.
And finally, we want to touch upon certain biases, and actually human beings are riddled with biases that prevent us from being as efficient, as effective as we can in dealing with climate change. And the silver lining is that I'm of the school of thought that believes that if we're aware of these biases, there is a lot we can do to intersect them and therefore behave in a way that is helpful for us to survive in the future. And there are three biases specifically that I want to mention that we need to be hugely cognizant of. The first one is status quo bias. The second one is negativity or negative bias. And the third one is the present bias. And very quickly, to give you a very hopefully simple enough definition, status quo bias essentially is us being drawn, almost pulled, like gravity pulls you to the ground by the desire to do things the way we've always done them. And we can see that in every aspect of our lives, not just in relation to climate. The negativity bias, generally, as humans, we tend to scan instinctively as a self-protection mechanism for the negative in every situation at the expense of any positive angles. And for news, this is exaggerated as a bias. And present bias is our unfortunate discounting of the future is the simplest way of saying it. It's easier for humans to promise big changes ahead in time and willing to incur big costs in the future rather than incur smaller costs in the present or make smaller changes now, because we tend to cling on to the present more and discount the future. So what we found is, one of the things we asked the audiences in Nigeria, UK and US recently is to imagine 2050 and imagine what would news be reporting in 2050. And then Richard and the team analyzed the sentiments, whether they were positive or negative. And what we found is that there is an overwhelming, in fact, in the USA, people were 9 times more likely to project pessimism onto the future than optimism. In Nigeria, 4 times, in the UK 6 times. So there is not much hope there. It's very negative. So we need to beware the self-fulfilling prophecy generally as human beings, but also journalism has responsibility to ensure we don't just throw ourselves off a cliff and do nothing. So the status quo bias is manifested in many ways. One of the ways is the fact that the targets that are set by governments and businesses are looking at 2030 and 2050, and of course there are infrastructural needs to do that, but they are very far in the future. And the problem with with that is both it activates present bias. So people discount that. They think it's irrelevant to them when they see such far deadlines so far away. So what we did through analysis of news coverage using GDELT is look at what % of stories that mention climate change mention 2021, 22, 23, 25, 2030 and 2050. And you can see from the color coding that the further away we go and project ourselves forward, the more coverage of the news we find referencing that period. Now, when we asked audiences, what period would you like to hear about most in news reports in terms of climate change progress being made or improvements? The picture is pretty much inverse. What audiences want to know more is about what's happening this year, much more so than certainly 2030, and definitely not interested in 2050. So there is real gap in what news coverage provides vis-a-vis what audiences want in terms of climate. And finally, we will leave you with 5 recommendations that we generated based on all of the gaps and the biases that we found. Firstly, as I mentioned, we need to be very cognizant of the self-fulfilling prophecy that at the moment there isn't much hope anywhere, and in order, we know that from psychology, in order for us to make progress, we need to believe that that's possible. So ramping up coverage and story narratives about progress that's made already, and Richard is working with a number of organizations that actually work on climate, not journalism ones, and he was struck and told me that how much progress actually has been made from the documents you've read, isn't it? But we don't hear about that. And there is a really interesting article that we've quoted in this presentation from Columbia Journalism Review that summarizes the news coverage eras, the one in the 80s, 90s, summarizing it as it's real. That was the time when the case was being made, followed by it's bad. And admittedly, we're still in the it's bad era of climate coverage. And what we are arguing is that we should move to an era of it's bad, but we can act to contain it and move coverage in that direction. Secondly, focusing coverage on near future dates is going to help audiences feel that the story is more relevant to them, but also advocating for challenging politicians and policy makers to introduce short-term milestone targets. And report on them and just challenge them and make it clear, what does that actually mean, these targets? What are the steps that need to be taken? So 3 more recommendations. Make the climate vertical a horizontal lens, i.e. introduce a climate lens into other beats, which is what Richard was sharing the evidence that that's not happening, nowhere nearly enough. And increasing volume of coverage and its relevance to audiences is critical for their engagement by ensuring that all stories about climate contain an angle that's relevant to them today in their lives, but also all coverage of important stories has a climate lens within it. And as we mentioned earlier, and we've said this many times actually, avoiding solely apocalyptic and catastrophizing headlines and reports is incredibly important, especially if we are to nurture and look after the younger generations who are going to have to sort out the mess that older generations are leaving. Finally, somewhere in the report having an angle that activates their hope or alludes to the progress that has been made, so that as well as activating anger and desire to act on it is something that we recommend doing. So basically offering content that helps audiences empower themselves and feel more empowered. So I want to leave you with a quote by Timali Kodikara, who is one of the presenters of Mothers of Invention, the podcast, who says, "It's not possible to unbleach the coral reefs or unburn the fires, but at its most progressive, climate solutions journalism frames the future as collectively authored and imagined." Thank you.
Brilliant, Luba, Richard, thank you so much for the huge amount of work I know that has gone into that. There are plenty of comments in the chat here. I'm asking if people can get the presentations, and really thank you for the eye-opening data that you've shared. I want to actually ask the audience here the same question as Luba and Richard asked their cohort in this study, in terms of what are the emotions that you feel when you think about climate change coverage? If we think about the coverage, particularly seeing as we're talking about journalism, so you'll see that the poll has just popped up on your screen. So please just pick one, and then we'll have a little look at the results in a bit. I'm going to come back to the other questions that you've put in the chat for Luba and Richard in a bit, but right now we're going to hand across to Meera to hear from her and from the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. Meera, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jane, and thanks so much, Luba and Richard. It's really, really fascinating research, and I think broadly I agree with pretty much all your principles. I think the one thing that struck me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this later, is the phrase climate change, and using that as a marker for stories about this topic, because I think one thing we found, which you later address, is that the story of climate change is not just about climate change, it's also about politics and economics, and often it's written, or should be written, in terms that don't even include that phrase, or use either alternative phrases, or just assume that it's there in the background. But I think this is partly why we started the Oxford Climate Journalism Network, to address the point you raised quite rightly, Luba, that you don't need a climate vertical, you need a climate horizontal. So we don't believe really that climate change as a topic can be covered adequately at all by just having one desk in a corner of the newsroom writing stories. It's something that all journalists need to engage with. And if I just take one step back a bit, at the Reuters Institute, what we try and do is help the media industry face the challenges of tomorrow. And what became very, very clear is that the challenge of climate change is in many ways a challenge facing the entire industry. It's how do you deal with a story that's global, both immediate and also incredibly long distance, with a multiplicity of actors, with no clear outcome, no clear start, beginning, and end. How do you tell the story in a gripping way? How do you keep people's attention? How do you use data visualization effectively? How do you tell the story on mobile? How do you do it justice with visuals? How do you accept, sticking with the visuals point, of a diversity of audiences? So how do you, use visuals that don't just use polar bears and kind of people, barefoot in deserts to illustrate your point? And then the other kind of absolute vital thing is the youth. And you've touched on this as well, but what young people feel. And the media industry has a problem generally appealing to young people. And we have two things that we're coming at this from. Our research shows in many ways that television is still incredibly important for as a source of where people get their climate news from. Globally, it's still kind of the most significant factor, far more than any other digital or print news sites. But it's obviously, and young people tend to watch less and less TV. So where do you get them? And then the other thing is how you view climate change. You talked a little bit about the despair and pessimism, and that's very much there. And there's a study that Nature published, a study of 10,000 young people, that shows a huge anxiety over climate change. And 95% of them, they say they're either a little worried to extremely worried. Only 5% say not worried at all. And more worryingly, there's a survey by Tim Garton-Ash, a professor at Oxford, about attitude, European attitudes. And part of it is the attitudes of Europe's young. And there, 53 of young Europeans say that they believe authoritarian states are possibly better equipped to deal with the climate crisis than democracies. And this is kind of a huge thing, because then what are we as a media? You know, we see ourselves really as a kind of space to promote democratic discourse or to kind of promote democratic values. And then if there's a kind of section of society that says democracy and the media are not addressing climate change adequately, there's a huge, huge problem. What we're also seeing now is that the climate change story is about values. And, you know, yesterday we had the argument, the news that Germany was cutting off Nord Stream 3, and I was at a talk given by Sir Alex Younger, who's former head of MI6, who said, you know, it's very clear now that Germany, it wasn't so easy for Germany to link its energy supply to that of a country whose values it did not share. So you suddenly you're confronted with these very difficult decisions. You can't separate out security of energy supply and your energy policy and your environmental policy to your values and the values of other political entities and other nation states. And so this is something we're going to absolutely have to confront. So the Oxford Climate Journalism Network was set up as a response to some of these challenges, but crucially to help journalists, working journalists in newsrooms, their senior editors, address these issues. And what we wanted to do was create a global knowledge sharing network where the knowledge sharing goes in all directions. So we don't have a situation where we sit in Oxford and tell journalists around the world to do their job, but what we do is provide resources and tools and a network for them to be in. And we started in January with 100 journalists from around the world. And it's been a really kind of fascinating exercise because we were overwhelmed with the demand and the support from huge newsrooms, from, you know, large international news agencies down to small digital mobile only publications in, you know, in the kind of Pacific Islands. But they all kind of want the same thing. They want to be able to convince their editors to take this seriously. They want to readdress how the newsroom sees this topic, how the news agenda covers this topic, possibly to rethink the news agenda completely in the light of, you know, how it doesn't do climate reporting properly, and say if you're not doing climate reporting properly, chances it's not doing any other beats properly as well. And so this is a way to address everything. There was a huge issue of lack of data in certain countries. So a lot of countries saying, you know, we really, really lack data. And even if there is data, what we lack is somebody to guide us through and show us where to look for data and how to interpret it. Lack of access to key scientists and key thinkers. And again, the countries that are affected most directly by climate change often find it hardest to access the kind of both the scientific data and the scientists themselves on this. And then the other thing, which again you talked about, Luba, was about network and solidarity. This is a pessimistic story that really takes its toll on journalists covering the issue. So a lot of journalists feel very lonely, very dispirited, very demoralized, and just connecting them with each other and saying, here's a space to share your thoughts, your experiences, resources, and sometimes just to complain has been tremendously useful. And, you know, it's something that we knew that that journalists need that space, but it's very, very striking how much it's needed in the climate space as well. So I think I'll kind of wrap up there. I'd like to go to questions, but I think this I see in the questions there are some points about Africa and Pakistan, and this is absolutely true. We're actually hiring a researcher from Pakistan to very much address the gap. That region is not really kind of considered in the research. And what we're trying to do with the lack of data in other countries is take scientists like Freddie Otto, put them in front of the journalists in other countries, both as access, but also to say, she's very good at saying, this is a kind of scientist at Oxford who works on weather attribution, she's very good at saying, there might not be exactly the same data in your country, but look at, for example, the kind of Met Office, the Weather Office data, and there is quite a lot you can learn from that, and let me tell you how you can use that. So we're kind of addressing these on a kind of quite broad level, but also a granular level, and also be very happy to take more questions on this.
Wonderful, Meera. Thank you so much. And it really is incredible. I was looking at the list of your first cohort of 100 in the Oxford Climate Journalists Network. It's amazing. From Chad to China, you know, Brazil, Britain. You've got, you know, so Solomon Islands I saw there. You know, going back to Richard and Luba's point about sort of island states really being fully into this.
Absolutely.
Just, I guess, a quick public service announcement. If people on this call are interested in joining the network, your first session is already going. Are you going to be doing other sessions? We'll
carry on. So Yes, we'll have another session, another kind of open call applications in March for the next session, which will start in July, and then it'll carry on, every 6 months there'll be open calls. There'll also be leadership courses on this. So, for kind of senior newsroom editors and newsroom managers, we'll offer separate bespoke courses as well, and we'll announce details on those soon as well. They'll all be via the Reuters Institute website and our social network channels and newsletter.
Superb, brilliant. So we've got, how long have we got? We've got about 30 minutes, so we've got quite a decent amount of time. So I just want to kind of have an open conversation between the four of us. And as I said before, if you're watching, please do put some questions in the Q&A. We are watching it, as you can tell, because Meera's already answered a couple of the questions. So we'd love it to really work for you, this bit of the conversation. So I'm going to turn there first and link it in with the question that Meera raised for Richard and Luba. So Nitin Koka is asking, was the research that you did, Luba and Richard, was it just done in English, or did you have proxies for other languages as well? And I guess then that ties into the question that Meera was asking about the term climate change, and whether we're being too reductive by just using that term, whether we should be sort of mixing up some other ways of describing what's going on.
Okay, so in terms of other languages, the database we use, which is actually an amazing database, which we're very happy to share the URL. It's called GDELT Online, and it's a freely available database of since 2017 of 7.5 million stories. You can put in 750 million stories, and when you enter a term in English, it enables you for that to be translated into 65 languages, and so that whatever term you enter, the AI will change it into different languages. So, and it covers all countries, and so the data can be broken down by Pakistan or by Nigeria or by US and UK. So it's incredibly rich. And to the point about the language around the term to search for, we've actually done quite a bit of work looking at different terms, both for ourselves in our research and for the organizations we work with. And you're quite right to say that if you reduce it down to climate change, you get over the last 5 years about 1% of stories mentioning. But if you just reduce it down to just climate, just the term climate, it's only 2%. If you put in the environment, it's just over 1%. If you put in pollution, it's closer to under 1%. If you bring them all together, climate change, pollution, the environment, on average, it's less than 4%. So the overall narrative changes a bit. The overall numbers change a bit, but the big point is that it's still marginalized given the enormity of the story. And so it's a very good point to make, however, because we've got to be quite forensic. But we've looked at it, and we can see, sadly, that the coverage is still low. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I think you raised the point, Meera, in your remarks about many of the people in your network wanting to change the news agenda, and Luba and Richard referred to making the vertical or horizontal. I love that idea. So putting climate across all the different topics. Do the people in the network see resistance to that? I mean, sometimes it can be difficult, I guess, if you're on the lifestyle beat necessarily, to think that climate is a core part of your coverage. But what sort of stories are you hearing in the network?
We've had a lot of buy-in from newsroom managers to apply for the network. If you're a staff reporter, we ask for a letter of support from your editor, partly to ensure that you'll be given time to participate in the network, but also kind of more general buy-in to the concept that this is something that is that someone's going to participate in this network and then go back into their newsrooms and be allowed to implement change. So we're seeing kind of a willingness to change, but the barriers to it are very, very practical, the way they are in any kind of newsroom innovation, which is time, resources, sometimes a CMS that just doesn't kind of adapt. And more broadly, there are a lot of climate stories that can only really be told effectively with cross-border collaboration. And there are some news outfits, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, news agencies that do this. They know how to do it. It's built into their model. They have bureaus or stringers around the world and they can do this. But a lot of news organizations don't and can't and don't really know where to start. So that's kind of one of the big factors we're seeing in kind of resistance. And then the other one is it's just a lack of awareness. So we had one lecture by a scientist last week, and in the middle, we got an email from completely spontaneous from a Sunday Times travel journalist going, this is so mind-blowing and inspirational and a privilege to watch and terrifying. And, you know, he's obviously been covering this beat for a long time, but just to be given the chance to listen for a while, and he will no doubt eventually go back and have that influence how he covers the travel sector, but most travel journalists have not been given this space and opportunity so far, and most, you know, and there are lots who won't be able to. So that's kind of one of the barriers, really.
It's really interesting because I'm thinking about how so often different topics will sit in silos in the newsroom because we want our specialization. We'll have a general desk that will do the general news, but you really do sort of seek the specialization, don't you, to get into really good analytical and insightful coverage. And I wonder if there are any lessons that we've learned over the last couple of years from COVID. I managed to get, you know, all the way through almost 50 minutes without mentioning COVID, the other C word. But I wonder, like, have we learned some lessons from how we report on COVID in terms of, as you're saying, access to data, access to scientists, some of those other things? Do you think that there's something that we can springboard off?
Yeah, I can have a go at that, because we've talked about this a lot, and we had a series of lectures at Green Templeton College on science and media that looked at this very much. And I think COVID has been extraordinary for two reasons. The having scientists stand up on public platforms next to politicians, next to elected politicians, sharing data, explaining public policy. I think science media centers and institutions that kind of try to broker links between scientists and journalists have done an extraordinary job. And in newsrooms, what you've seen is how you can the science desk can become a hub for other kinds of reporting. So this, you know, so you can have a politics story that needs to be kind of funneled through the science desk for kind of data. And the other thing we've really seen a lot of with COVID is kind of huge leaps in data visualization, infographics, in how to tell the story through data, and also how to report on uncertainty, because I think this is what the media has been very, very poor at doing, and politicians have been very poor at communicating to the public. That often you're in a kind of fast-moving, uncertain environment where all you can report on is what you know now. And if the situation changes, it doesn't mean you were wrong before, it just means the situation has changed.
I think that fits really nicely into what Luba was saying about, sorry, you were about to come in, maybe you're about to say the same thing about the status quo bias and the like.
Oh, no, finish that, but I want to add something else at the end.
Okay, go on.
So I wanted to, just to pick up on Meera's point around data and science reporting. What we feel has really been highlighted during COVID is the need to feel comfortable interrogating numbers and going underneath the data. And that's something that sometimes often journalists seem to lack the confidence to analyze data. And COVID has shown how important that is if journalism is to remain independent of political views and able to challenge and to hold those in power to account. With climate, there's a need to really do the same, go underneath the data, and actually for the data to be reported almost the way COVID numbers were reported, so that the relevance of the story becomes a lot more prominent for audiences, whether it's reported in weather reports or in well, Guardian is doing that and some others are doing it. They have a daily metrics, but that is very important too, is what I was going to say.
And I think, you know, you mentioned the present bias as one of the sort of three kind of key biases. And I do think that's an issue as well. And I was fascinated by the comparison between dates that we talk about and that we report about versus kind of what the audiences want as well. And that kind of solutions thing, which I just wanted to delve into a bit with you all. Like, have you seen some good examples of solutions journalism? We don't want to put band-aids on a massive, great story. But where are some of these solutions? And Richard, I'd love to hear about some of the progress that you've been hearing from the other climate groups that you've been working with.
We've been doing quite a bit of work with the likes of The Guardian, and what they found in their work on biodiversity, especially, what they found is that often when they do have a lens which, as Luba said, gives hope and gives some dimension, and has some solutions element, and I think that often the problem with the term solutions journalism for people who are kind of not initiated, it sounds like you're talking about something that's a bit happy clappy and it's all great. Actually, it's very detailed investigative forensic work, which is really stress testing policies and solutions. And they found that when they do present that kind of really rigorous work, the levels of engagement are quite high from audiences. And by levels of engagement, we mean commenting, sharing, talking about. And so maybe there's something we need to do around how we frame and talk about solutions, rather than it having that sense of being a bit fluffy, that it is hard-nosed, detailed, and as Luba and Meera have been saying, it's a lot of data, it's a lot of evidence, which makes it credible.
That's a really, really good point. I love your phrase about it not just being the happy, clappy, fluffy stuff, because it's very easy, isn't it, to hear about somebody doing something interesting, and I love those inspiring stories, and I don't think we should stop doing them. If the inspiring story of a single person who's gone and made a difference, or a community that's gone to make a difference. But at the same time, I think, as you're saying, the more that we can get into data and kind of really the proof points, I think, data changes emotions, doesn't it? And we want to kind of keep moving people along that way. You've mentioned the GDELT database, and Meera, you've been mentioning data. For people on this call, do you have any top tips about how to get themselves or actually their colleagues as well, so more data literate? I think the point that you were just making about the COVID visualizations, you're absolutely right. Like, seeing the visualizations made it very real for ourselves. We could see what's happening in our particular area and the like, and we could take actions as a result. Are there equivalents that we should be looking at for climate literacy rather than just COVID literacy?
I'm going to put a link into chat, because this is the answer I give to everyone. There's a wonderful site run again by a team at Oxford called Our World in Data that is terrific as a starting point, because it just takes all sorts of data sets around the world and allows you to pull countries, so you get comparative data on pretty much everything. So, the homepage is focused on coronavirus data, but you can look at kind of climate change, you can look at politics, and it's just a really, really good starting point to kind of start playing around with data and data visualization, and taking that and then using tools like Data Wrapper to kind of create products that work for audiences. But I think starting with a kind of large data set like that, and then playing, and then kind of seeking out gaps. Very specifically on climate, I think it's interesting that the International Energy Agency has now finally said it would make all its data freely available, because we did have a very odd situation where a lot of the data on energy policy around the world that was freely available was being made freely available by the oil companies. It was BP and Shell that were providing the data that poorer countries could use, and the international organizations that were gathering it were kind of hoarding it behind paywalls, which just feels both morally wrong but also completely counterproductive in this space. So I'm glad there are some changes, but overall we do need to keep highlighting this issue that data needs to be freely available to the people who need it the most.
Just one quick point I want to make. We're actually doing some work with the International Energy Agency, and if there's one report which I think it's worth as many people reading the summary of, it's a report they brought out last year about net zero and the strategies to get to net zero. Because one of the things we found incredibly hard is to navigate what's actually going on, what's going up, what's going down, what needs to happen in each of the different energy sectors, what policies need to be in place. And I think for any journalist to read that report, you don't need to agree with it, but it gives you a map to understand the moving parts. So I'd highly recommend that as a first step.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to some of these excellent questions that we have in the Q&A box. I'm going to start with this question from Francis, who says, COP27 is taking place in Africa later this year in Egypt. What stories or news angles should journalists in Africa look out for as a precursor to the event? And I think that's a really interesting question, because as well, that question did come up about kind of where the data was from and whether we could get any sort of breakdowns by region, which you told us that we can on the database, which is fantastic. But any thoughts about, so we saw that massive spike in coverage and interest around COP26. How can we do the same for COP27 and particularly reaching audiences in Africa? Luba, do you want to take that?
Yeah, from memory, I know that some of the angles that will be really interesting to cover in Africa, or what audiences are very interested in, is unemployment, crime, so look at those angles: unemployment, crime, poverty and inequality. These are real winners with audiences everywhere, but specifically in African countries.
And just to add to that, one of the things we showed in the chart was through GDELT. So again, using that tool, you can break it down by countries. The island state, or in fact, the state with the highest proportion of articles mentioning climate change was Seychelles, and Burkina Faso and Rwanda also had high proportion of stories. And in general, sub-Saharan Africa has a high proportion of articles written about mentioning climate change. So there's obviously, within the 54 countries, there are obviously some countries where the concern is particularly high. So there are great case studies that can be written for particular states.
Are there any thoughts to add there?
I agree completely with Luba and Richard, and especially the kind of question of inequality. But also there are a lot of elections coming up in a lot of key African countries, including Kenya, Angola, Senegal, Libya, Mali. So, and these are all in one way or another going to be climate change elections, in that the policies and the party, the parties' manifestos are going to have widespread implications for how climate change and energy policy maps out in these regions, both in terms of domestic economic policy, but also development policy and foreign aid. So it's worth kind of bearing that in mind as well.
And that's a really great way of, thank you so much for that question, Francis. And it's a really great way of sort of showing what we mean by taking a vertical and making it horizontal. In a way, you don't just want to be talking about COP27. You want to be showing how climate is a key part of all of these political, economic, social stories. So that you're solving that volume gap that Richard and Luba were talking about at the beginning, that we're not just going to the climate desk to talk about climate, but really integrating it into so much of our coverage. Thank you so much, everyone.
Can I add one thing, please? So one of the things we discovered when we were writing the missing perspectives of women in COVID news was how little of the coverage was using the human interest frame. And that risks desensitization. And actually, if you look, we're now looking and tracking the deaths, and we are somewhat desensitized to them. So, and what we know is that audiences, that human interest stories are like a skeleton on which to hang the data findings and to make it more memorable and more emotionally compelling. So my big plea is to not forget those angles, whatever we're covering, to use them when discussing climate coverage.
Thank you, Luba.
And female protagonists, please.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and let's use that as a springboard, because you're absolutely right. Who are we telling the stories about? Are we telling the stories about oil executives in suits, or the you know, the different people who've kind of traditionally been in power, or are we actually telling the stories on the ground? So you mentioned telling women's stories and female stories. There's also a question here from Addy Sawag, who is talking about reaching out to the youth, and that the panelists have clearly said that demographic is elusive, TV still reigns supreme, and yet the majority of youth worldwide don't reference TV as their source of information. So what's the solution? How do we reach, how do we engage the youth? How do we get them out of this sort of this despondency that Luba and Richard were talking about, that sort of fear and sadness? How do we make sure that we are engaging and partnering with a pretty active youth when it comes to issues of climate change? Meera, take it first.
Sure. I think there's two elements to kind of youth audiences in media. First, where do you find them? So what platforms do you use for distribution, what formats? And there you can talk about whether, so, you know, what forms of social media, whether it's TikTok, although I suspect TikTok has now jumped the shark slightly and become something older people use, but Discord, the kind of gaming, you know, the chat platform that a lot of gamers use. I think there's a lot of platforms where the kids hang out and where we need to kind of be with these stories. And the other thing which is related to this is what they do on those platforms and how they view, because like we said, the young people are very concerned about climate change and they do want information about climate change, but they also possibly are less concerned than the older generation about impartiality, objectivity, the idea of balance. And I think a lot of what we need to get to grips with as a media industry is the fact that young people feel alienated by older journalists trying to portray this topic in particular, but also other topics related to diversity and identity, as one that needs to be portrayed as a sense of balance. On one side, this viewpoint, on the other side, that viewpoint. They're much more amenable to the idea of activism in journalism, to kind of create and to, you know, have a kind of sense of campaigning journalism, and then also to be quite have the news that they consume tied up with identity of who they are. And I think this is where we need to kind of figure out what we mean by impartiality and balance and objectivity, because there are all sorts of questions. We're going to have an entire, you know, separate discussion on this, but impartiality is often a certain perspective, which is often a dominant, you know, Western, often male perspective. So that's not necessarily impartiality. It's just what we've come to understand as impartiality.
That's a very good point.
This is such a great point. And just to add to your point, Meera, about identity, one of the things that that media does in relation to climate story, as we already said, is saying, okay, this is a real problem, and leaving young audiences despondent. On the other hand, there is quite a significant proportion of media that dismisses their perspectives and calls the millennial snowflake generation and the generation Z, the woke generation, and essentially is patronizing them, dismissing their perspectives, leaving them despondent, and then hoping that they'll engage. So to your point about sensitivity around their identities and having respect for this generation and having a sense of responsibility for them and their well-being is really important as an important sentiment for news to have when we write, when we target this audience.
Yeah, very good point. There's a very interesting question here which takes us away from journalism per se, but into corporate storytelling. So our Peter asks, how important is the involvement of corporate storytelling beyond conventional journalism in tackling the climate change narrative? Anyone have a feeling about sort of how businesses are getting into storytelling here, whether we want to ally with them or any advice that we would give them as journalists?
So do we mean, if we mean the communication arms of corporations, then it's both an opportunity and a real challenge. For those there's a danger of greenwashing from corporate organizations where, or corporations should say, where they are spinning a narrative. In that case, then it's every journalist's job to really, seek that out and expose it. But for those organizations that are recognizing, and actually globally as a journalistic community, we need to recognize that corporations have to be part of the solution, given their economic power globally. And so the advice really is for those organizations to be honest about where they are, and honest about their plans. The moment there's greenwashing, then the credibility collapses, and it feeds into the despondency and dismay that Luba has talked about. So honesty and openness, I think, is what we're asking from the corporations.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And again, sort of engaging people in terms of what we can do together. Yeah, greenwashing is a disaster, isn't it? I mean, that's just going to turn everybody off. Yeah, I think I've got time probably just to get these last couple of questions in. I'll squeeze them in. So I've got an interesting question, and it's a really critical one, from Julie Safitri. Sorry, I mangled your surname. But asking about training programs on climate journalism. So Meera, maybe this is one that we can throw to you. He's talking about in Indonesia, just like the number of disasters that have happened, and yet climate change is highly underreported here. So any hints to find those good training journalism for general beat reporters?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of organizations that provide training into news through the Earth Journalism Network. The Thomson Reuters Foundation, Deutsche Welle provides other training programs as well. I think Indonesia is a really interesting case because it's so vast and so much of the environmental destruction kind of happens in hard to reach areas. And then Jakarta is a separate issue of kind of urban pollution and density and traffic management and infrastructure. So it's kind of vast, complex. I think Indonesia in particular, a lot of the training needs to be mobile. Mobile first, because vast swathes of the country, people are only online via mobile phones, and also crucially video. I think we see there that kind of mobile videos seem to be the most effective way of providing any kind of news, and lots, all sorts of kind of technology on mobile. So I would suggest seeking out training that focuses on those two things. And that, like I said, there are organizations, but I also do think, interestingly, that Indonesia, weirdly, given that it's so vital for the environmental security, not just of its own country, but of all the countries in Southeast Asia, it's weird that it has been neglected in many ways in this space. And yeah, you're absolutely right. We've actually got Indonesian journalists on our fellowship program who kind of talk not just about climate change, but about this generally. And it is one country we're trying to look at more.
That's great. Thank you for focusing on it, Richard.
Jane, can I just make one? But one of the things, Luba, we met at the BBC News, and we introduced a tracker of stories over a decade ago. And one of the things that used to amuse us every week was the love of weather, and how weather was always a top concern. And actually, in this context, there may be a weather opportunity. Now, obviously, we can't ascribe in individual days to climate change, but it is a window virtually for every news organization to think about. So what's our weather reporting strategy? How do we bring in climate change? At what point? When the big events happen, what's our narrative? What journey are we taking audiences on to interpret some of these daily events? It's the point Luba was making about bringing the proximity of the daily experience to the big picture.
Absolutely, and actually related to that, I've just realized we've got Singapore news executives on this call, and Singapore is affected annually by the haze that sweeps in from the fires burning in Indonesia, and and Singapore has its own policies for reporting on it and for dealing with it. But what may be really useful is to provide some support for Indonesian journalists to be able to do their own reporting on the ground there.
Yeah. Brilliant. We're almost out of time, so I want to turn back to the poll that we put up just at the beginning of this conversation section. So I don't know, do we have the results of the poll? Is that possible to get up on the screen? Ah, there we go. Frustrated. There you go. Luba's taking a photograph of your answers.
Yeah.
Luba and Richard, this is your question. So what's your response to the poll result? We've got 0 people saying sad, by the way.
Yeah, well, it's a very excellent case of empowered audience. Frustration is an audience, and anger, they're activating emotions where you feel you can do or you want to do something about it. And the fact that hopeful is so much higher than sadness is incredibly heartening. I feel very optimistic about the reporting that's going to happen from this group.
Wonderful. Well, I've got about 15 other questions that I had prepared for you all, but this time has gone very, very quickly. And I know I need to pass back to Sherilyn before we hit 8:45. So I think I've only just managed to do it. I've kept my brief by about 2 seconds. Sherilyn, thank you. Over to you.
And thank you. That was wonderful, on point. And Luba and Richard and Meera, fantastic to be able to access your thoughts and experiences. I think this video is going to travel far. I've already had some requests for it and for some of the studies. So we'll share that with you in the next day or so. Do share it with your colleagues. It's one of those long tail resources that will be of use to people who haven't been able to join the conference. On the question of training in Southeast Asia, this webinar, and indeed the ones we've had during the week, are the result of a training program that we've been running in Southeast Asia on the challenge of the climate crisis, which has been funded by the Temasek Foundation in Singapore. We have been training in Indonesia and countries around the area. So hopefully if we can get a next round of funding, we'll continue with that this year. So do keep in touch. We've got all your email addresses. We'll share the videos with you in the next day and hopefully keep the conversation going, because I think there are a lot of important reports coming out in the next few days that will be a good opportunity to look at how you're covering that one dimension of climate change in the official reports, and hopefully work on the more human interest stories that Luba and Richard have pointed that are so vital to keeping hope alive. Good. Thank you very much for your time and for the early start, and have a good day.